in this area. Oh, that was exciting. We just learned recording is in progress. I don't know if you heard that too.
If you're just joining us, this is Katy Milkman in the middle of answering why and how she chose to write this book.
Answer to why I wrote the book, which gets us to sort of writing the book. So we founded this center, brought together lots of people who have shaped my knowledge about all the best science, and we've been trying to accelerate science in this area. And I felt like I knew enough that I was ready to try to put it out there in a form that would reach many more people than our typical academic articles. So that's what motivated me to write the book. I felt like there was something useful to say, and it was time to spread the word.
And is that feels like a similar drive to do the podcast, right? Like are these similar, or how are these motives similar and different?
They're really similar. I think that's right. The podcast is another way to reach a different kind of audience. It's more bite-sized. And I think the nice thing about a book, in each chapter, I know you were just reading and looking through, each chapter ends with sort of bullet points. It's a little bit more portable, I think, and durable than the podcast. But the podcast is another way to reach a broad audience. The podcast is a little bit less focused on behavior change and more on behavioral biases and how can we reduce biases in our decisions. But obviously behavior change is a big focus of the podcast as well. And we make about 12 episodes of that each year. And that's been amazing. I had no idea how many people we would reach when I started doing that. It just sort of sounded like an interesting thing to try. And I took over from Dan Heath, who was the previous host and who'd done just a great job with the first season. And so I got to listen and I said, wow, this is really good content, but it wasn't going deep into the science. There were very short snippets, like an expert interview for 2 or 3 minutes at the end of a story. And I took over the role of host and expanded the science content a lot. Now I get to talk with friends like you. We have an episode together just in April about, actually, I see the alien behind you. I'm sure we'll talk about that later, about some of the research.
You're the first person to notice it. It's up there just as like as an Easter egg for anyone who wants to notice it.
Well, we'll get there. But right, so we did that episode on the power of different kinds of reminders and how important forgetting can be as an obstacle to change and to reaching our goals. At any rate, it's been tremendously fun. So thanks for asking about that too.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was reading, and I don't know if it shows up, but every chapter ends I'm sure it's not legible right now, but
we can tell that there's bullet points.
Yeah, with the chapter takeaways and the bullet points, which is like, it's clear that in the writing of it, you are trying to be useful, and you are trying to be useful at the end of it. I mean, like, if you were skimming this, or if you want a refresher, these are the actionable things. With that, did you actually, I actually noticed that and emailed a collaborator about how we need to do that more in all of our writing. What, was this an idea that an editor pushed on you, or did you?
This was an idea from the amazing Dolly Chook. Which, you will appreciate. She's a professor at NYU and one of our other litter mates from graduate school. And she was an early reader, and she has a wonderful book of her own called The Person You Mean to Be, about reducing bias in our own lives, the bias that we exhibit towards other people and being a better ally. And she was an early reader and suggested, there's this book, it's clearly written to be useful. There's all these actionable takeaways, but if you gave us bulleted lists at the end, it would be great for those of us who like Cliff's Notes when we refresh our memory. So I was resistant at first, actually, because I felt like, I don't want this to feel like one of the, for dummies books. And I worry about that a little already with the, how to change the title. But ultimately, the goal of the book is to make the science as useful as possible. And so Dolly convinced me that this would be a way to help.
Yeah, I mean, it actually both functionally works to make it more useful, but it also sends a really strong signal that the point is to be useful. So I put this next to nudge, and I read nudge, and it's about changing other people's behavior. And how did you think about this as it relates to nudge?
Yeah, Nudge is probably my favorite book. So I thought a lot about how it related to Nudge, and is it, just trying to be Nudge 10 years later, which of course is actually coming out this summer and is a book everyone should read and will be fabulous. I think you might have had Richard Thaler in this forum before. I actually thought he put it very well in a conversation on Twitter when he said, if nudge is about changing other people's behavior, this book is about self-nudging or snudging. And I am very glad I didn't ask him for title suggestions. I don't think snudging would have been the best way to frame it, but I think that's right. I mean, a lot of the insights in the book, I hope, can be applied not only to improving your own outcomes, but you can see most of the research is done nudging individuals and organizations, but I try to turn the lens both directions so that the stories and the research, you can see how to apply it if you want to improve and you want to achieve a goal. But also if you're a manager, a teacher, or a coach, that there's lessons from that perspective too. But it's more snudging than nudging. Yes,
and we will not. Well, I agree. Snudge.
I don't mean for snudging to catch on.
It doesn't fit so well with the white cover and the blue whale or whatever it is. Just it's how to snudge. I will say. What's that?
It's a swan, not a whale, but.
It's a beautiful swan. I can see it
like
now.
Something that the Cape Codder would put on their shorts. So I get it.
I can actually say that was definitely, I mean, I spent some time after reading it thinking about like how this relates to this other work. And it's this focus on self, like changing your own behavior, which are also relevant, as you said, for managers too. I think that's great. And it achieves that. So what is now I've got my endless list of questions and I have limited minutes. What surprised you most as you were writing this book? Like what research or insight or application or framing as you're putting this together, you're the master of your own research. And it is very much, I'd say 80% your research, whatever the percent is. It's a large percent your amazing research, giving lots of credit to everybody else for their influence on it. But what did you find the most interesting that you learned as you were putting this together? Because you're reflecting on this for a year or two or however many years.
Yeah, I think actually one of the most interesting things that happened in the writing of the book, and you would think that I would have had this figured out before I wrote it, and that you would, I, at least, having never written a book before, had a fantasy about how a book is written, that you have an outline and you write your first chapter and then your second chapter and your third chapter, and you have the theme that you'll string throughout. And it's like, and actually Max, who I now know is in the audience and who writes a book a year, and they're all brilliant. I bet that is the way he writes his books, but that is not how I wrote this book. And I did not appreciate the structure that I would land on, which ends up being that the book is structured around the different obstacles that often stand in the way of change. And that's really the main theme, is to recognize that in order to make change effectively in your own life or in others, it's really important to understand what exactly is it that's standing in the way, and then to use the best scientific techniques that tackle that obstacle. So to be, just to make that really clear, imagine somebody comes to you and says, I'm not taking my medication. I know I should be, and I'm gonna die of a heart attack if I don't get on my meds. You'd want to give them really different tools and approaches to solving that problem if the reason they're not taking their medications is they keep forgetting, or if the reason they're not taking their medication is a side effect that, even though it's not that major, it looms large in their mind when they're making the decision each night. So you do really different things if it's about a barrier of discomfort versus forgetting. And that's kind of what the book is about. Like, there are all these different barriers. Once you understand what it is, you want to tailor your solution. That did not emerge as the key theme until actually pretty far along in the process. And I'd say, in a way, that was the surprise that in writing, I discovered what I realized were the key categories of barriers to behavior change. Sort of, they came together in that process. And it actually surprised me that I hadn't recognized that before, what these categories were, and also helped me understand where I want to do work going forward. I would say there's one barrier that I didn't write about. I did a little bit in chapter, it didn't get its own chapter heading that I think is super important. I know you've thought about this too, Todd, which is when we stumble and we give up, sort of how do you get people to get back up again and not give up completely? I touch on it in a couple of chapters, but it's worthy of its own chapter, if not book. And I actually just think we don't know enough about how to make sure that when people get a little off track, they don't veer completely off track when they're trying to achieve something. And I'm really eager to study that more, in part because of my realization in writing this book of how huge that barrier is and that we don't know enough about it yet.
So that's almost like discouragement or resilience, or I mean, you're not talking about grit as an individual difference, but you mean in the face of failure, recovery, and
right. And sure, we know things like growth mindset matters, right? And you know, the kinds of people, you know, the social support we get can matter. And I write about this work on having elastic habits, and there's work on mulligans or emergency reserves, sort of structuring with mental accounting, ways that you can sort of play tricks to convince yourself you're still on track. But I think we need to know a lot more, because that seems to be, it's the common experience, right? If you think about New Year's resolutions, 10% of them are achieved. Okay, if we use all the science in this book, my optimistic estimate is maybe we could take that to 20%. It's nowhere near 100%, and most of it, you know, something goes wrong and we give up. And so what are the things, how do we plug that hole better?
got it. It's not necessarily even discouragement, like, you know, your 401k with John, with John Bashir's of like people, the norms being discouraging, or the military academy of being paired with the best students discourages the others. You're actually just saying like the persistence even of your initiation of change.
Exactly. It's persistence, which, I mean, you know, the Behavior Change for Good initiative Angela and I co-founded was really all about how do we keep change rolling? What is it that creates habits and persistence and durability? And I do address that, but it's more when there is something that goes wrong in your path to persistence, how do we get you back on track?
Well, but that's the next book. In this book, so let's talk about elastic habits. Before we got on, Katy and I were talking about this, and I found it was probably the most surprising research finding in here for me when I was reading it, that I was disappointed, embarrassed that I had not read this paper that Katy had done. And it was really sort of a pretty powerful insight. Can you tell us about elastic habits or flexibility of habits?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And I should say this is joint work with John Bashir's, who's, I don't know where everybody is in the world, but for those of you who are in the Harvard community, he's just down the road from you at the business school, and another one of our litter mates and a brilliant economist.
Wait, Katy, the word is brood. I should not have said kennel. Brood is the right, so litter mates.
I don't think Max would have approved of kennels. Anyway, that's a whole.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Given that the patriarch of our litter feels very strongly about treating dogs like, you know, perfectly, I don't know if he would have liked the kennel reference. Anyway,
I'm sorry.
Okay, so this study with John, we had this idea, and it turns out, anyway, you'll find out the punchline in a minute, but we had this idea about a way that we thought we could make habits more durable. And there's been a lot of research in the last 15 years, I'll say, in economics about how you can use incentives where you reward people for repeatedly engaging in a behavior and help them build a habit that then lasts beyond the period when your programming ends and you stop rewarding them. They just, you know, they've created this habit and they stick to it. And we thought we can do a better one. We can build a better one with this insight from psychology that habits are cued by context. And if we can get people not only to repeat a behavior for, say, a month at a high frequency, to create a habit, if we can get them to repeat it at the same time of day, every day, it's going to be even stickier. So we ran this experiment with Googlers. That's the name Google uses for their employees. We had 2,500 Googlers who wanted to build lasting exercise habits at the company gym, who signed up for a program we designed that lasted for a month and offered rewards for exercise. And we basically wanted to pit two types of people, or people who got two types of instructions, I should say, against each other. One group of people who, due to random assignment and the instructions they were provided with, we convinced to go to the gym at a consistent time of day, every day when they're going. And another group who goes at the same frequency, but instead of always going at the same time, they mix it up more. And so we used incentive structures to generate these two groups. I'll abstract away from some of the study's uglier details. And we ended up with one group of people who's going to the gym 85% of the time at the same time of day, when they're making visits, and another group going in an equal frequency, but only half their workouts are at that, I'll call it their normal time, the time when they get a reminder to go and they've told us at the beginning, this is the usual time for me. So 85% consistent versus 50%. Okay, so that's a month. We're observing them for a month. Then we let go. The program ends. They're left to their own devices. And the question is, which group sustains exercise? Who's built a more robust habit? And we were sure it was going to be the group that had been going at this consistent time, 85% of the visits at the same time. And I'm laughing because we were wrong. So we weren't completely wrong. So one thing that we had right is that magic time, say Todd had been in our study and told us, I'm a 7 a.m. workout kind of guy. I aim to go at 7 a.m. every morning. If Todd had been in that 85% of workouts at 7 a.m. group, he actually is a little bit more likely to show up at 7 a.m. from here on out. So he's built a slightly more stable habit.
After the study is over. So
after the study's over, we're just watching, right? There's no more incentives. We're just trying to watch and see what happens now. We've let go of you, and have you built a habit that lasts? So Todd, who 85% of his workouts were at 7 a.m., I'll call him Todd 1. He has built a slightly more consistent habit around going at 7 a.m. than Todd 2, who is only making 50% of his exercise visits at 7 a.m. But if Todd 1 doesn't go to the gym at 7 a.m., he doesn't go at all. He gives up on himself, right? It's 7 a.m. or bust for these people. We had thought of them as having a routine, but now we realized actually it was rigid. We made them rigid, not routine, but rigid. And the people the Todd 2 who learned to go to the gym, half the time at his regular time and half the time at other times, if he doesn't make it at 7 a.m., he still goes later in the day. And as a result, he's built a more robust pattern of gym attendance and goes more often after the end of our rewards period, the end of our study, net. And that was completely contrary to what we predicted, but really interesting. And the key insight, I think, is about the importance, and I call it elastic habits, the importance of having flexibility. Because what we see is, right, if you don't have a fallback plan, and this is very related to what I was saying, is I think a really important topic for research moving forward, like how do we get people to persist, not give up on themselves? Those people who built rigid habits, they're inflexible to life's mess, right? To the thing that comes up, oh shoot, now I have to drive my kid to school. I thought my partner was going to do it, but so I don't have 7 a.m. to myself to do my workout. And then that throws everything off. But if you've built a more flexible habit, then you still go later in the day or at some other time. So there's sort of the only if habits and the no matter what habits, which are the flexible habits. And those flexible habits turn out to be really important. And I thought that was really interesting. And to me, when I was trying to make sense of that finding, which again, completely contradicted our hypothesis, one of the things that helped me think about it was my own experiences training as an athlete. And I realized it's very analogous to the way, so I was a tennis player. It was very analogous to the way I trained.
26 minutes in, I wrote down, I'm like, how long till we hear about Andre Agassi or tennis?
It was only like 1 minute in if you pick, or 1 second in the book, but I did actually have one early reader who was like, is there too much tennis in this book? Maybe slightly. Anyway, the analogy for me was when you're playing tennis, if you're practicing, some people like to practice by having someone just hit a ball right to the perfect spot where they can sort of line themselves up and hit a perfect stroke. But if you practice that way, you're actually going to do really badly in a match because the ball does not always come to the perfect spot so you can line up for the perfect stroke. And so the best way to practice is, running all around, trying to hit one when you're off balance and when you're running forward, when you're running backwards. And I feel like what we learned about habit is that it has a similar set of features, that you need to practice the habit under duress, under all sorts of circumstances, rather than only forming it and developing it to be robust to perfect circumstances.
I find this totally intriguing. So I'm going to nerd out on the contextual associations that trigger the habits. The way Wendy Wood and you describe a typical habit is the performance environment or some cue triggers an automatic behavior that doesn't require intention. And that's fantastic in a stable world, where you have the same schedule and the same physical environment. Brushing teeth triggers flossing or whatever else. But then in a messier world or a world in transition. That's actually the way it's always been studied. That's how you break habits. And that's like your temptation bundling study with Thanksgiving break. Like, so what are we making that, what are we building the habit into if it's a flexible habit? I mean, what's the concept of a habit then?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like, should we even call it habit? Should it just be elastic patterns or something? Elastic behavior? Is it a habit if it's just a repeated behavior that you've become really consistent in performing, but it isn't truly automatic in that it's not always performed at the same time in the same place? I think, I don't know if Wendy would even call what we found a habit at this point, but fundamentally from our perspective, what we're trying to create is durable and persistent behavior change. And so whether you call it a habit and it has those automatic processes or not, what we're seeing, I think, is that maybe habit isn't even the right thing to be striving for in some of these contexts where it's a repeated behavior, because they're too brittle. Maybe it is too brittle to have that cue for some of these things that require a bit of time and a fallback plan and so on, right? I think with brushing your teeth, right, probably for both of us, it's like the first thing you do when you wake up and the last thing you do before you go to bed, and you're always going to wake up and you're always going to go to sleep. So that's going to work. But for a lot of the things that come in the middle of the day, having that consistency and the same cues may not be the way we can create lasting and robust behavior.
Yeah, when you wrote it, I was thinking, I actually marked that I need to go back and read it more closely, because you were almost arguing that, and I'll go back and read the original paper, and I'm embarrassed that I had not seen it before. It's almost like you're arguing, like we're associating the good behavior with something a little more abstract than the rigid time of day or physical space. I don't know what it is.
Though to be fair, I do think it's important to note that everyone in both experimental conditions in the study did make plans and had a regular time and got cued to do it at that regular time. And it was really about fallback plans and how important they turned out to be, rather than a no matter what first best, or excuse me, rather than an only first best plan, I think is an important way to think about it.
All right, great. Thank you. New question. So you said that Angela Duckworth thinks that the top thing to change behavior is cue-based plan making of some sort. What do you think is the top of the list for someone wants to change a behavior? And I know you wrote you say read all 200 pages, but you're talking to someone.
Yeah, if I have to pick what's the greatest hit, I think this insight from Ayelet Fishbach and Caitlin Woolley for me has been most important and transformative, and I think is most valuable, which is the insight that most of the time when there's some new behavior or some new goal that we want to pursue, we look for the most effective way to do it. And we're like, let's stay at the gym. We were just at the gym. I'm going back to the gym, but obviously it's just one location that we're all familiar with, and you can port it to your favorite problem, whether it's being more productive at work or, learning a new language, whatever it is. Okay, but so you're going to the gym and you want to form a new routine around exercise. Most people would say, let me find the most effective machine for achieving my fitness goals. How am I going to sort of burn the most calories per minute if that's the reason I'm going to the gym, get my muscles most in shape. And they might go pick the maximally punishing Stairmaster. But a small subset of people make a different decision and say, let me try to find the most fun thing I can do at the gym. And, maybe they go to a Zumba class with their friend. And what Ayelet Fishbach and Caitlin Woolley have shown is that if we convince more people to choose the second path, the fun path, we'll actually see better results, because if you do it in that way, if you look for the most fun way to pursue your goal, you'll persist. Whereas if you do it in the painful way, okay, yeah, your first workout got you closer to your goal, but you'll never do it again because it's so miserable. And the fundamental insight is just present bias, the tendency to overweight immediate gratification, underweight those long-term goals and benefits that lead us to do all the things that are good for us, like studying in school and exercising at the gym and eating healthy foods and working hard at our jobs, saving for retirement. Because we overweight the present, we won't persist when the present experience is negative. And so like if we recognize that about ourselves and figure out ways to make the present experience not aversive and in fact desirable, that is the best thing we can do to achieve so many things. So anyway, I think that's my favorite insight. And then, you know, there's lots of different ways to approach it by making it social or temptation bundling, which can work in some circumstances. And Ayla and Caitlin have studied this, obviously not just at the gym, right? It's one of my favorite studies they did with kids in school and getting them to persist on difficult math problem sets. And their teachers, of course, are sure that if you try to make it fun by playing music and giving them snacks and markers, that's going to be a distraction, but the kids actually persist longer, again, because they're enjoying the work instead of finding it to be drudgery. So that's my favorite. Do you have a favorite? Do I get to interview you and ask you? Do you have a favorite insight, Todd?
Sure. And while I think about it, I'm going to ask you another question related to that. So it sounds like let's say going to the gym is aversive, running on a treadmill is aversive, but I like listening to Harry Potter or whatever the movies were, the books were, and I pair them. I've always thought of it, and I wonder if this is the mental model that you have, that like there's habit building, which is like slow, and then it ascends over time, and then there's the sort of like pleasure of the thing you're bringing to it, the compensation, the incentive, that sort of deteriorates over time. And what you need is to like pass some escape velocity of behavioral repetition before the incentive or whatever either goes away or wears out. Is that a model that is consistent with the way you're describing? Because you're basically saying we're not going to eat M&Ms for the rest of our academic careers whenever we're reading books that are less interesting than yours, which require no M&Ms. But like there's these two sort of like
the M&Ms are the stories. Anyway, that's separate.
Yeah.
Honestly, I actually am okay with eating M&Ms for the rest of your life. I love your model of we need to achieve, we need to just do it long enough that it becomes a habit. But I am increasingly skeptical of actual stickiness. Even when we do, it seems like we get someone to persist on something for a while. Maybe we get 30 to 50% of that habit sticks after we stop rewarding them, encouraging them, whatever it is. It's never 100%. It's never more than 100%. And because of that, and because so many of the things we both study can be low cost and perpetual, I actually don't think there's a need to ever try to have escape velocity, but rather like, for instance, so we're sort of alluding to this temptation bundling idea, which is one of the techniques I used first and have studied to get myself to the gym. I only let myself listen to my favorite tempting audio novels. So think like James Patterson or Da Vinci Code. I realize I just gave an author and a title, but anyway, pick your favorite books. And I only allowed myself to listen while exercising. It made me want to go to the gym. I looked forward to my workouts, but I never stopped pairing those things and said like, oh, now I have a workout habit. I don't need the hook anymore. I still do it because it still makes my workouts more fun. It still prevents me from wasting time at home on trashy novels. And I don't ever plan to decouple those things. So I think probably we should be using a lot of these crutches forever.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's so bad. I'm okay with that. Like it's not aversive to me to continue to do that. It's still working.
I'm with you on that. You used a metaphor that I use, is that behavior change is sort of like a chronic condition and not a inoculation.
Rash? Do you talk about it's not a rash? I keep seeing that quoted on Twitter, and I'm like, maybe that was the most eloquent way to put it.
Yes, maybe not a rash, but I mean, sometimes a one shot is a cure, and 401k defaulting people into 401k savings is pretty close, but not many things are like that.
Right. And when we can find those one shots, like, wow, are they great? And it's a really nice thing to study and figure out how do we make all of those one shots. But yeah, I agree. Most of the things aren't one shot. So I think we need persistent solutions.
When I was reading your last chapter on conformity, this copy and paste idea, I love that. And it was almost like a Kaiser Sose moment, because I was like, oh my God, I've seen her do that so many times.
You're like, she copy and pasted me.
Yeah. Well, I will give a very brief description of the idea, ask you to expand. But the two examples, that the basic idea is, Katy, is like, if you're actually, please expand on the idea, and then I will give two examples of how I've seen you do it to incredible effect, kind of inspiring effect.
Todd. Yeah, it's so fun to be talking to you about this work, since we haven't talked about the work we did together, or the fact that you were the protagonist in one of the book's chapters yet. We'll get there.
We can skip that. That's fine.
Skip that. Okay, so this idea of copy and paste. So we already know, and there's a chapter that reviews this, that through sort of, I'll call it like osmosis or natural processes, we're very influenced by the people around us. And we often, if you get a college roommate who is a high performer, it actually lifts your own grades, for instance, probably because you notice they're studying on Friday nights, and maybe that makes you feel pressure to do the same thing. You figure out that you should emulate them to some degree. But an insight that Angela Duckworth and I had when we were talking to our students and to each other about behavior change is that not everybody maybe takes maximal advantage of the opportunity to deliberately emulate people they know who are doing smart things and putting those insights towards their own goals. And we realized it was something we had both gotten from each other, from our own relationship, which is your fault, by the way, Todd, because you introduced us. But Angela's one of my closest friends and collaborators. And when we first started working together, it was actually, I mean, there were many wonderful things. There's wonderful things about a new relationship, but in this new work relationship between two people who both had similar goals, one of the cool things that happened is we kept being like, whoa, that's how you handle that situation? Oh, that's how you do that? That's how you optimize your life for this? Like, oh, Angela, you take work calls whenever you're walking from point A to point B on campus, and it's a 10-minute commute or more, and then you have 15 free minutes later in the day for writing when you're at your desk. Like, there are all these things we noticed we could copy and paste. I'm going to do that too. So anyway, we ran a study, and I talk about it in the book, that proves this, giving people this insight and telling them, go look for someone in your peer group who's achieving your very same goal, and then literally deliberately copy and paste what they're doing. That's better than just telling people to make plans, or actually then giving them an insight someone else found, probably because when you go find it yourself, you find something that's more self-relevant and you get some social information along with it.
That's great. Yeah, the one that I have seen you do, and the one that I have incidentally copied is, and there's many more I need to copy, but this model paper, when you're writing a paper, when Katy writes a paper, and we've written a few together, it's what do we want the structure of the introduction to look like? And it's like, well, let's find another paper that looks like we want this one to look, and then write paragraph structure, start with an outline that looks like theirs.
And by the way, that's very meta, because it's like we're copying, and anyway, yes. Or it's a copy. You copied and paste, my copy and paste, right? Because we're literally copying and pasting.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. But we don't use their sentences or
right.
their ideas.
It's the structure. It's the structure. And actually, I think that's one of the things Angela and I talked about. Like, there's so many places and parts of life where this is beneficial, from like, how do I write? I can borrow the way someone else who's effectively communicated does. Like, by the way, in writing this book, one of the things that was interesting is how often, and now I've heard this from lots of other people too, people were like, oh, what would Malcolm Gladwell do? Like, how would he write this? And you're like, oh yeah, this is how Malcolm Gladwell would do it. And so that's how I should do it too. How often we have an exemplar in mind, and how much better we can get if we don't, that we try to emulate to achieve excellence.
Well, the other one is the story of what was, I think, maybe both of our first couple papers was this Quick Flicks paper. And Quick Flicks we can name, but we did a paper where we were working with a large
Netflix too.
We can name Netflix too? Okay, good. Well, now it's official. Well, we were working with Netflix.
We did work with Netflix. Yeah.
Oh, we did or we did not?
We didn't in the end. We were. Anyway, you tell the story.
Okay. We were working with an online, actually a DVD mail order company in the US, and found a result, interesting result, not going to get into it. And then the company decided they didn't want to give us the data anymore. So we were not allowed to publish it. And so while I went home in despair and like watched brand new episodes of Seinfeld, because that's how long ago it was, Katy, within 24 hours, had found that there were 7 other companies around the world that had similar businesses, and then searched the Harvard Alumni Network and the Princeton Alumni Network and cold emailed people, emailed all of them asking if we could replicate the study on them. And within 2 weeks, we had data from the Australian version of Netflix. And so I talk about that a lot with doctoral students and collaborators, that like, okay, well, it is what it is. It's a sunk cost. We lost the data. Where are there other similar things where we can just copy it?
I love that. I've never thought about that as a copy and paste, but you're right. And you do that really well too, because I know when you work with schools on projects, given how many fall apart, you have a model where you try to actually set up parallel projects. So at least, worst case scenario, you have 2 studies at launch and you get a lot more data than you need and have a really well-powered experiment. And best, or maybe that's best case. Anyway. Right. And in another case, which is either worse or best, depending on your perspective, you only have one that moves forward, but you still have one, even when one dies. So anyway, we're learning from failure.
Yeah, that redundancy I think is brilliant. I'm gonna ask one more question, then we'll take questions from the audience. There's a big theme in this book, which is something that I have not heard you talk about before, which is like finding it for yourself and tailoring the interventions to yourself. And Andre Agassi plays a part of this, but it also it's taking heterogeneous treatment effects seriously, but also imagining that people might be actually good at predicting whether the effects are going to be heterogeneous on themselves. And I wonder whether you think people are good at this, or how we can help them be better at finding what they'd be good at, whether it's the kind of thing AI would be good at, or productized, or like, how do we help people tailor these to themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. And another one where, more research would be really, really valuable on this. I think I'm thinking of it more, or I was thinking about it more in the sort of Ideas 42, which is a behavioral consultancy that Todd and I are both affiliated with, mode of a diagnosis process being important before you tackle change. And that I actually don't think it's very subtle to figure out what the barriers are most of the time and what they aren't, either in ourselves or others. That it's often like, we talked about the gym a lot so far, so I'll just keep with that theme. The gym is a place where forgetting, for instance, is not likely to be a huge barrier, but the fact that it's, for most people, not super fun to go is a large barrier. And we could probably say kind of across the board, that's mostly the case for a lot of people. It might be that you're too busy. There's probably some heterogeneity, but I actually think in a lot of contexts or with a lot of problems, there's a couple things that we can diagnose as researchers or as organizations or as individuals as the most common problems. So I don't know that it always has to be tailored at literally the individual level. It's probably more about the context. And then the individual may have some heterogeneity that they can play with, and like, well, for me, what makes it fun to go to the gym, or for me, what works best when I'm trying to schedule my time is the following. But I think the diagnosis process is fairly easy, and it's the bigger barrier is just recognizing that we need to do it. You and I know we've complained about this together. So often in behavioral science, we see organizations that are trying to use the playbook from behavioral science, and they like notice that a thing that works a lot is saying everybody else is doing it, and like, printing in big letters, like 85% of people say they want a vaccine. Like, that's how we're going to get everyone vaccinated, because social norms are really powerful and they always work. Instead of thinking more carefully, like, is this particular very, very useful, very cheap, very popular behavioral science trick the right one for this environment? Is it really that I think no one else is doing it and that's why I'm not comfortable doing it? Or is there some other barrier? So that's what I was getting at more, I think, than the personalization. But I am very, very excited to see how AI and personalization will play out. I'm also, though, in my own work, when we've tried to figure out like what works best for whom, been shocked by how often there are not heterogeneous treatment effects. but I think there are heterogeneous treatment effects across contexts, right? Like when I do something in a gym versus a school versus with a bank to try to get people to save, the thing that leaps out as the success story is normally different because I think the barriers are different. But it's not that, Sally and Bob are so different who both want to save more. It's rather that saving is different than exercising.
That's really interesting. So first, Ananya Chandra asked, what are heterogeneous treatment effects? Just want to be clear. Sorry, we're getting all jargony. Heterogeneous treatment effects are when the same intervention has different effect size on different groups of people. And what Katy just said, I think is really, really, I want to underline. So a lot of the most powerful interventions don't show really large, predictable differential effects.
Right, like you don't see like men and women respond really differently to making it fun, or older and younger people, or people who are from minority populations and Caucasian populations. You see often, I mean, this is obviously a wild overgeneralization, but I'm surprised by how often when we test what will nudge a change in behavior, we see no differences across populations when we slice up the data. Like they're basically all getting the same benefit.
Yeah, and I share your incredulity when I've seen this with voting, with like millions of voters in an experiment, and we don't find reliable differences in treatment effect. Like different groups vote at different rates, but adding the intervention increases turnout the same amount, or with increasing student absenteeism, same thing, which is continue to be baffling. I do want to just I'm going to ask Jose Arellano question, but I'm going to name check somebody who used Snudge in their question real quickly. Terry, thank you for using Snudge. I actually don't use it ever again. Wasn't that the conclusion?
Hashtag Snudge.
Okay, so Jose's question is, diagnosis is important. Diagnosis is important. Are we really or accurately aware of our own barriers for enacting a particular behavior? I mean, I think that's a really frontier question. What do you think?
It's a really frontier question. I think at the level I'm going into in this book, probably are. So the kinds of barriers that I'm talking about are barriers like, do not enjoy it in the moment. Do you forget to do it? Do you find that it requires too much energy and change from your current routine? Do you feel like your social support network is not aligned with the goal? They're not really subtle things. I think there are probably many subtler barriers to change that we're not familiar with, and that would also be really beneficial to diagnose and try to counter specifically. But I think that the big stuff actually probably is fairly accessible to most of us if we at least, anyway, this would be a very interesting thing to study. But when I look at the diagnosis process, for instance, I mentioned Ideas 42, I think they're able to do a pretty good job of figuring out what are the barriers. When I talk to individual people who are trying to figure it out, most of the time, I think it's pretty accessible to us to say, yeah, doing it's a chore versus I love it. I look forward to it at the end of the day. It's just that I don't have the time or I can't make the plans to schedule around it.
Yeah, I worry about some of the diagnosis procedures. They seem like they'd be great, as you said, at identifying barriers, but sometimes it's not clear that they would identify promoters, like things that can promote the behavior. That isn't because you're being blocked. It's just like you didn't realize that making it social would make it more desirable. So we've got a few questions in this vein here which is more about you as a public intellectual and public communicator. So curious to hear more about the modes of communication you use, Katy. Do you consciously change storytelling approach when writing versus developing podcasts? How would you describe the difference, if there is any? And more broadly, like you are a behavioral scientist storyteller in addition to being a scientist. And so what have you learned about the best way to communicate to the public? that last half, the unclear half was mine. Drop that. Go with just the first one, which is what's the difference?
It's a really interesting question. Stories are so much more memorable. There's a whole chapter with Todd as the protagonist about memorability and how important it is for behavior change. But stories are more memorable, they're more persuasive, and it's part of why the podcast and the book share so many when, in my personal life, I mostly share science. Like if Todd and I were just having dinner, I would tell him all about a study, but I probably wouldn't tell him about the person whose life changed because they used the technique. But I do think having that memorable anecdote is critical to both relating, because you can say, oh, I relate to that protagonist. I see myself in them, and it helps you figure out how to do it. It's almost like social norms, right? One of the reasons social norms works is you see someone else doing something and they model for you how to do it. I think stories have that element of modeling for you how to do it. They're fun. So you don't lose, your attention span lasts. I won't tell you how often I get to the end of an academic paper, but it's not as often as it should be. Whereas I tried to write the book and develop the podcast in a way where it keeps you interested in what happens next, and stories do that. But I will say I tell more stories about the science in the book than I do in the podcast, because I was willing in the book format I was willing for the narrative to be brought forward by your curiosity about how to solve the problems and what the science said a little bit more. Whereas the podcast, we try to tell a coherent, cohesive story about some memorable moment in a person's life, some make or break experience for a company, and then later dive into the science. It's more woven. The science is more woven through the book. And I think that works, that it's a little harder to break up a narrative in a podcast form and insert science, and easier to do it in a written form.
When you make a podcast, do you make it presuming that the person is listening to the entire podcast? Like, do you ever think, well, I should front load it because some fraction of people are not going to get to the end where we unpack the underlying science? Or do you assume, like, look, it's a product, consume the whole thing, and you're not consuming it right if you don't get through the whole thing?
We hope people get through it, and actually, obviously, we have statistics showing that most people get most of the way through the podcast, which actually is really awesome. And we look. That's one of the metrics we care most about. And we can see which episodes are not performing as well. Like, oh no, drop off on that one. Like, I guess we shouldn't. I guess that wasn't the right guess, or I guess that wasn't the right way to convey the thing. We have an ending where I do a wrap up, and I definitely don't expect people to always hear that. But I do hope they'll hear both the story and the science. But if they don't, they'll get a story, but they won't really know the learning.
The stories are always fascinating just in themselves. I don't know how you dig out these.
I don't. I don't. I have there's the most amazing production team that led by a guy named Andy Shepard. In the very unlikely event that someone knows Andy, go give him a hug or pat on the back or shoot him a fan mail. Who was a radio host, and he chases down these amazing stories about athletes and history and corporate scandal, and he brings it to life once we choose a topic. So he picks up the stories. It's really fun. He does an amazing job.
I think this may be the last question from Trisha Zarfas. And I'm going to read the whole thing because she bought your book. I bought the book, Dr. Milkman, and I'm a huge fan of Choiceology. I'm halfway through it, and it's great. So let everyone else, you should go buy the book. Thanks to you and Dr. Rogers for everything you do. I have a lot of questions for you, but my family has a history with addiction. What insights can you share about addiction and behavior change? I get this a lot too, and I wonder, how do you think about it, like clinical addiction as different or similar to the kinds of behavior change that you think about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I pretty deliberately don't talk about addiction almost at all in the book, because I do feel like for the most part, it's well beyond the scope of the kind of science you and I do. The one topic where I think a really powerful behavioral insight has been applied with great effect to addiction that I cover in the book is commitment devices. And there's this wonderful study So a commitment device is a tool you use where you basically treat yourself like the citizen who a policymaker is trying to help improve their life, right? So we're used to other people imposing fines on us or throwing us in jail if we use heroin, or someone else decides what's not okay and creates structures and incentives to prevent us from doing bad things. But it's funny to imagine doing that to yourself, and that's what a commitment device is. It's a situation where you say, I want to fine my future self or punish my future self in some way if I deviate from my plans. And there's this really powerful study by Dean Carlin and Jonathan Zinman and maybe one other collaborator, and I'm blanking on the name, where they offered smokers an opportunity to put money on the line that they would forfeit in 6 months if they didn't pass a urine test for nicotine or cotinine. And so random assignment study, half of people are offered this account where they can put money that they'll have to give up, and the other half aren't. Both groups are given access to sort of standard quit smoking programming, and the group with the commitment device quit at a 30% higher rate. I think that's a really powerful result and shows that this kind of tool can be useful for addiction. It's unclear how many of the other tools in the book are potent enough, and a lot of them are pretty hands-off. And I think, being able to go get medical help, see clinicians at a high frequency are probably better advice than a lot of the tools in the book, but maybe commitment devices are something that can be useful here.
That is our hour, if you can believe it. So what I'm going to do is, Katy, thank you for doing this research. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing this book. There's a lot that I am going to copy and paste from it.
Todd, thank you for having me and for doing this research and being the protagonist of a book chapter, which I hope you will all get to read, about the amazing Todd Rogers. And thank you for being a great collaborator and friend and having me today.
All the same. We can keep going back and forth, but I see Maya unmuted herself, but I'm going to get the last one. Thank you, Katy. Okay, go ahead, Maya.
Thank you. No, I just want to say thank you to both of you and to our audience. The video will be posted on our Twitter page, and you can follow us at Harvard BIG. With that, thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you in the next big webinar.